Good morning, Anne, and thank you very much for giving us your time to talk to the Mint. I'd like to start with the beginning of the Labour opposition and John McDonnell's interest in the idea of new economics. Mm-hmm. And I wonder where that came from and what he really meant by that, what he intended with it.
Well, it really began with Corbyn. Jeremy Corbyn had his first press conference after announcing the leadership, and had a press conference on the new economics. And I think it's fair to say that the emphasis was largely on what Labour would do about taxation and redistribution. But it's evolved considerably since then, really. And when John came in, that was still really the predominant theme. Fiscal policy was the area of main concern, and the good news is that it's broadened out from that since then.
And so fiscal policy, and which I suppose new economics has quite a wide range that you could draw from.
Yes.
What sort of strands within new economics do you think initially caught their eye that they wanted to use?
I think the thing they are really keen on is participatory economics, essentially. The bottom-up growing economies at a local level and ensuring participation by employees in businesses. And also, of course, ensuring that employees share more of the gains and the profits made by businesses, and have stakes in the business and shares in the business, as John announced at the last Labour Party conference. So, and of course, Preston is the model of a sort of a new economics at a very localised level. And that comes out of the New Economics Foundation, which for a long time has been talking about local economies being like leaking buckets, with money pouring out of the local economy and going to big supermarkets based probably in Chicago or somewhere else in the world, and not coming back in again, and how then to transform that local economy to keep the money that is in there circulating within it. And I think that model is of enormous attraction to the Labour Party now.
It's interesting because so it's more that practical, hands-on thinking rather than any big names or sort of big thinkers that they wouldn't point to a Hayek or.
No, I think at the moment. I think there's quite a lot that's very pragmatic about the Labour Party's policy. The Preston model is an extraordinarily good one, and it's about using public assets, the National Health Service, the local station, the town council, and the funding that those institutions have, in order to spread the money around within the community, rather than using it to hand to supermarkets or to big international corporations. So it's about using the public sector also to relocalise and to ensure that, if you like, the emphasis, it goes back into the local economy. Now, I'm no expert on this, I have to say, Henry. This is not my patch at all. But my concern has been that Labour must also think about the international sphere and the international sphere in which, unfortunately, local economies work. And I insist on telling them the story about the little Devon tea shop that was owned by the local authority, or leased by the local authority, to a local person who'd run it for 17 years. And then the local authority was obliged, I think, by European Union rules, to put out bids for the new contract. And they did that. And the local guy was defeated by a company which I think is called Aram Mac, and which is based in Chicago and which builds canteens in prisons around the world. It's a global corporation,
right.
And it now owns a tea shop in Dorset. So what we need to understand, and I think this is not just true of John, but it's true of other thinkers in the Labour Party. So Rachel Reeves MP, who has written a book titled The Everyday Economy and launched it with the New Economics Foundation, also looks at and is very good about looking back at the real people in her community, the Deliveroo workers, the people in insecure part-time work on short-term contracts and so on, and thinking about how to restore their livelihoods. And she also has a very big focus on the domestic economy. And it is a good thing. It's a terribly good thing. She's concerned that we should look back. Instead of looking outward and internationally, we should be looking back locally at what is happening in our own communities and rebuilding the bonds of those communities. So I think this approach is pretty widespread in the Labour Party, and I've been urging them all, including Rachel and John McDonnell, and they come from different wings of the party, of course, to think more widely and to think about the international framework, which so much informs what happens locally.
I suppose it's interesting, though, that presumably there's some sort of interface between that localism and thinking about utilities and so on. And of course, utilities are to some extent protected from the, they're not subject to international competition anyway, are they?
Well, I mean, the railways are.
Railways are subject to international competition?
Well, in the sense that, it is that our railways are owned by European...
They can be owned outside, but actually in terms of sort of... You're not
I see sorry, I get what you're saying.
You see what I mean? So, sometimes governments have said, well, if you change this, the business will fail when competing overseas and so forth.
No, sure.
But that's not true in the utilities.
In these utilities, which are fixed and based here and so on. And also how I think Labour's thinking about how to make best use of those utilities and to divert some of their resources back into communities.
But they're also thinking, obviously, of renationalisation, but in terms of cooperatives, in terms of other sorts of
organisations. That's right. So cooperatives are also very, very important. And stakeholder economies, really. A stakeholder economy is something that John, I know, thinks about quite a lot.
So that was the sort of initial urging of the sort of new economics take.
Yeah.
You've now set up this group, or part of this group, called Progressive Economics. First, I suppose, why progressive as opposed to new? Is there any difference? Does that matter?
Yes.
And where's that? Is that building on this, or is trying to introduce new and different thinking?
So what had happened was, right at the beginning, Jeremy Corbyn had invited a group of economists to become an advisory group. That was made by Jeremy, not by John McDonnell. And it may even have happened before John, I can't remember, but really this was an initiative that came out of Jeremy Corbyn's office. And then we had the European referendum, the 2016 European referendum. And members of the committee were very, very unhappy with the outcome and resolved to resign en masse. I was the only one that would not resign.
Yeah.
I felt that was not the moment to give up the good fight. So that collapsed.
Before it collapsed? What had actually come out of it? What sort of influence had it been an effective body?
It had been quite influential. We'd had 2 meetings, but already Simon Wren-Lewis's fiscal rule had a lot of influence on John McDonnell.
And that fiscal rule was
simply that Labour would would borrow for investment purposes, but would balance the current budget.
Which some people felt was actually too conservative.
I personally think it is a little. It is more of a constraint on a future Labour government even than Gordon Brown's Golden Rule, and there are parts of it that I'm not particularly enamoured of, to put it mildly.
Is it still in place then?
Yes, it's very much so, and it's largely a political issue, of course, because Labour has been attacked from all directions for being profligate, and I think John wants to show that he would be careful, cautious and prudent. And I have to say that I have personal experience of John's prudence because he was chair of the finance committee of the GLC when I worked at the GLC, and he balanced the books all the time, and he was and my husband, Jeremy Smith, was the chief lawyer at the GLC, so he knows that John is a pragmatic and careful and prudent finance chair.
But he understands the difference between an organisation like the GLC and a country with a sovereign currency.
Well, I think he does, but I think the public doesn't, and so and certainly the Conservative Party would attack him, and the right of the Labour Party would attack him if they thought that he was going to be fiscally imprudent.
Which they would interpret. I mean, that's interesting that governments are still unable to effectively tell a story about the way money really works, as opposed to still the Thatcher idea of balancing the books of a household.
Exactly. And I have to say it's a matter of huge frustration for me, and indeed for all of the other members of the Progressive Economy Forum. But I think that that's a problem for the economics profession as well, which still, is attached to those ideas and still has trouble with the notion of money. But it's also the wider public. So we set up the Progressive Economy Forum to be more arm's length, in a sense, well, definitely arm's length with the Labour Party, but to advise all progressive organisations, the Greens, the Liberals, and progressive elements in the Tory party, if they should so.
And why did you want to be more arm's length?
Well, we think we think that the economists on the panel have to be able to express their own views and be independent and be able to be free to say things without worrying about the political implications of that. So that's the rationale for it being independent. But the key thing about it is that we want to develop an alternative narrative to the dominant economic narrative. And part of that means challenging this notion that the government is like the GLC or a household.
Yeah.
And it's hard work. It's something that we find ourselves repeating over and over and over again. And so we were thrilled when Philip Hammond announced the other day that it was the economy that would fix the public finances. It's not the public finances that fixes the economy. So we are beginning to make headway rather late, 10 years. 10
Do you
years
think
later.
Hammond really meant that, or I suppose politicians reach for an idea that suits their current pragmatic circumstances?
That might be so. Our real problem is not so much with the politicians, because I think they simply echo what they're told to say by the experts in their departments. Our problem is with the Institute for Fiscal Studies and also with the OBR and indeed with the Treasury, all of which still hold to this idea that the government has only got tax revenues with which to pay for expenditure, and that, like very good accountants, the government operates in a way that a business does and not in the way that an economy it does, with aggregate numbers of people and activity. And so the Institute for Fiscal Studies, for example, has this very narrow view that every penny of expenditure has to be financed by every penny of taxation. And the fact that the government can raise finance on the capital markets or from the Bank of England and use that finance for spending, and that can keep and can have a budget that's out of balance in order to restore prosperity to the economy. This is a very radical idea for the IFS. They simply cannot. So really quite a lot of our effort is aimed at organisations like the IFS and the OBR that won't, for example, accept that the Bank of England and banks in general can create credit out of thin air, that can be invested in productive activity that generates income and pays for the credit, and furthermore that something called the multiplier kicks in.
Yes.
When the government spends, unlike when you and I spend. When I spend, the shopkeeper doesn't send me a little present at the end of the month called tax revenue. But the government can spend on a nurse or even a construction worker, and the minute those are employed and pay PAYE, they start paying back taxes to the government, and then go out shopping and pay VAT, and the shopkeeper makes a profit and he pays capital gains, or corporation tax, and the government gets back 3 times over what it's invested in. And one of our problems with the fiscal rule, and one of our problems with the very artificial distinction between current and capital expenditure, is that if workers are hired to build, for example, HS2, and there'll be mainly construction workers, and there'll be mainly men and engineers and so on, they, of course, will generate revenue both in the form of tax revenues, but also, of course, because ultimately the railway line will collect train fares, and that too should return to any government investment. But exactly the same applies if the government were to apply a woman as a care worker looking after people with Alzheimer's. She too would pay PAYE. She too would go shopping and pay VAT, and she too would enable the shopkeeper to make the profits that would then result in corporation tax. So we don't like this very artificial, I don't like this very artificial distinction between current expenditure, especially on employment, and capital expenditure on employment. So those are what some of the arguments that we're having around this.
But there seems to be, instinctively a feeling that there is a bit of a difference between ending up with spending and ending up with an asset with future revenues tied to it, and spending on something that doesn't create an asset.
Yes, well, I mean, the fact is that we regard women caring for people as an asset. We regard having a healthy and stable, socially stable and society as a major asset, really, for an economy. Go to any African country where they don't have a health service and where women are left, lying outside, old ladies with no proper care, no proper sanitation, etc. And those countries lack the assets that we have, which of a healthy and sustainable economy. And of course, yes, it's not generating a single physical asset that will generate incomes in the future, but it's revenues in the future. But it is still a way, employment generates its own income, as we all know from our own experience, and employment generates tax revenues for government. And as Keynes always said, look after employment and the budget will look after itself.
So you've got this huge task of taking on the IFS, which is has this amazing brand and is always called on after the budget to comment on it, is continuously in the press.
Yeah.
How do you get into that space to actually counter them and be influential in terms of where they're coming from?
Well, Henry, the thing is that I think it's largely public education, and it's education, if you like, and its articles and its speeches, and we can have an impact. Now, my background is in sovereign debt and in Jubilee 2000, and when we began the campaign to cancel the debts of the poorest countries, people said to us, including leading figures in Oxfam and so on, oh, you'll never be able to explain to the public the nature of sovereign debt and multilateral and bilateral debt and the net present value of debt. These are all terribly difficult concepts, And I argue, no, they're not actually. And all it means is that you have to take economics or these ideas and distill them very accurately and very properly into a format and into language that is accessible to the wider public. And, when 100,000 people turned up in Birmingham in 98 to say cancel the debt, the politicians were bowled over, because why on earth would 100,000 people care about the sovereign debts of remote countries, And what that taught me, and that's the thing that really gives me confidence, is that once the public understands, there's virtually very little you have to do, actually, because they take it in hand, And it's already happening. This idea of the government as a household is mocked very, very widely, not just by experts, but by the public out there. Everybody knows, well, a lot of people now really know and understand that argument, or know that, of course, it's silly to think of the government as a household.
But I suppose you could say with I can imagine raising my arm saying, cancel the debt, and marching. What's the equivalent that could light a fire, if you like?
So look, when we got the debt cancelled, the main thing was to get the public behind that, because that put pressure on the politicians. But the really important work to do was to get the evidence right and to influence the IMF and the World Bank in Washington and the Paris Club in Paris. And these were the world's experts, right? And we had enormous arguments and debates and prepared reports and evidence and marshalled our arguments, assembled our evidence and took them on. And we changed their way of managing the finances of the low-income countries and forced them to introduce something called the sovereign. They discussed the sovereign debt restructuring mechanism, but in particular a mechanism for resolving and then cancelling the debts of the poorest countries. the HIPIC initiative, it was called. So the fact is, I know that this can be done. It has to be done on several levels. You have, on the one hand, to persuade the IFS with real sound evidence. But on the other hand, you have to place public pressure on the IFS and on politicians to see that. And it's worked. It's already worked in the case of Philip Hammond.
Well, it's interesting, I suppose. Will that change the, how did the IFS react to Philip Hammond's...
I would love to know, but I can't imagine that it didn't cause a stir within the offices of the IFS.
Have you had meetings with the IFS?
No, but we are planning to. We're planning to have a proper debate with them.
So you can debate the theory and the ideas.
I've been on a panel at the Treasury Select Committee with the IFS and with the National Institute of Economic and Social Research, and presented my very, very different take on the government budget, and which, the committee, I have to say, took really seriously. But the very fact of being on the same panel with them in government to talk about how the budget should be assessed, in my view, is an indication of the fact that we have growing influence, and that they are forced to listen to these ideas.
So that's the sort of ideas and nitty-gritty and getting that in. I'm still not sure what's the cause. I mean, there's the sort of, is it anti-austerity, for instance? Is that something?
For the Progressive Economy Forum. Well, the founder of it is Patrick Allen, and Patrick is a solicitor who has worked with a lot of people who've suffered the injustices of austerity, and he feels very passionately that we have to discredit austerity completely. But of course there are people on the council that have been doing this for many years, since 2010, and I include myself in that.
In terms of trying to discredit austerity?
Yes. So it's been a long, hard battle, and it's a battle that we've lost pretty emphatically in Europe. In Europe, austerity is, and what is happening to Italy as we speak, and what is being done to Greece and to Portugal and so on, is almost undoable now. So, there's a long way to go.
but May did announce the end of austerity.
Well, exactly.
So it's interesting. So that timing-wise,
yes,
you might begin to have an audience, do you think?
But then I am particularly concerned, and there are others on the council with the same view, that we should broaden out the debate now beyond that and into the international sphere, and persuade politicians that they have to start thinking about the international framework within which the domestic economy operates.
And what sort of things would they do in that space then?
Well, so this comes back. I mean, we've just had a wonderful conference where we've discussed all this with the OECD, the TUC and the TUAC. Basically, the international financial architecture governs the way economies work. What's very interesting is we looked back at 1919 when Keynes was in Paris. Paris was in turmoil. There were riots, there were strikes, there was a general strike, May Day 1919, and the Versailles Treaty was being negotiated. And Keynes came up with a very simple plan to support the recovery of Germany, and that was that Germany would issue bonds to the tune of £1 billion or so. These bonds would be guaranteed by the Americans, the French and the British, and they would therefore have value. Germany would use those bonds to raise finance from the capital markets. The Allies would guarantee those bonds, and so they of course would attract a good rate of interest, and that could be used for A, reparations, and B, reconstruction in Germany. And then his idea was that, and he also thought that the other smaller countries could issue similar bonds, and then those bonds could be used to settle debts, allied debts between France and Britain, Germany and Britain, and also the United States. But ultimately he wanted those bonds guaranteed by states to become a form of international currency, to become the new reserve currency, and for that currency to be backed by the real economies and the successful economies of the United States and the weakened but still quite strong economies of Britain and France, and then hopefully in the future Germany. And and that would then mean not relying any longer on the gold standard. It was a very radical idea.
Okay.
And he put it to Lloyd George and Permanent Secretary and the Treasury, and surprisingly they loved it. They put it to the other allies who liked it, and then it went to President Wilson of the United States, and he wrote a letter back rejecting the proposal and killing it off. And Eric Rawchway, who's just written a history of that period, tells us that actually the letter rejecting the proposal was written by Mr. Thomas Lamont, who was the chief executive of J.P. Morgan at the time. And of course, J.P. Morgan were very concerned that these new bonds would take priority, would take precedence over the private bonds that J.P. Morgan had been issuing at will during the war. They were financing all of the warring parties on the Allied side, and they wanted their bonds repaid. And they were not going to have any other bonds that would take priority over theirs. So he killed it off, really. And for me, that was incredibly tragic, because then Germany struggled to recover. There was all this, then we get devaluation, depression, we get a massive recession in the United States in 1920-21. Manufacturing production falls by 32% in 21, because of course the United States hasn't got any customers to export all its goods to anymore.
Right.
And so on. So
J.P. Morgan are responsible for the Second World War, not the Serbian assassination.
Well, I think it must have broken Keynes's heart to watch unemployment, the 1929 crash, the Great Depression, and then the rise of fascism and war, when actually it could have been fixed and Germany could have been helped to recover. Then, post-war, we get Bretton Woods, and then that is dismantled. And we're back to what is effectively now another kind of gold standard. And this is what's interesting.
How is it a gold standard?
Well, in the sense that we now have... the gold standard was, in fact, gold played very little part in all of this. It was there as a kind of symbol of stability, but in fact... the value of currencies and the value of interest rates and the determination of interest rates was done by the markets, was done by people active in the capital markets, and exactly the same. There is no architecture today. Instead, some of the key determinants of the health of the economy, the exchange rate, the interest rate, the value of the currency, and so on, that is all determined by the international capital markets, and governments have very little policy autonomy. So I think what we now have to talk about, and of course what has happened is we've had the great crisis of 2007 and 9, we've had a period of austerity and deflation, which is very similar to the deflation era after World War I, and we're now moving into the rise of populism, fascism, nationalism, and so on. So we're repeating the errors of the 1930s, and I think it's really important for us now to think again about the international framework, and to think again about building an architecture which is more stable, but which more than anything else gives policy autonomy to governments, allows them to focus on employment, focus on stability in their economies, focus on stabilizing their exchange rate, focus on getting their interest rates down, because investment, for example, in Britain is very low because we have high real rates of investment, of interest on investment, and that's been the case for many years and explains our low levels of investment and our low levels of productivity. So that's where I would like us to think.
And I suppose paradoxically what you're saying, that actually a collective structure between governments gives individual governments more autonomy.
Indeed it
not
does.
Less.
Indeed it does.
Which is a sort of interesting.
We then will have, if we succeed, and what we've had in the past but dismantled, is we will have a system governed by public authority, not by private authority. And governments will be in the driving seat, so to speak. Right now they're not in the driving seat. And that is why we've hollowed out our parliaments. That is why social democracy has collapsed, because the people have lost confidence in governments that are not in the driving seat any longer.
But I suppose President Trump would write the same letter as written in 1919 if anyone sent him a request to set up an international framework.
His speech at the United Nations was very interesting. I think, of course we all know and I think can agree on what we think about President Trump, the child president as he's called. But in his speech to the United Nations, he talked about the globalists. He talked about this idea of an authority that is remote and that is globalized. And of course he turns it into the elite, and he then also makes it anti-Semitic. For him, a globalist is the Jewish, whatever.
Jewish banker?
Yes, I mean Soros, of course, is the
the ultimate.
Yeah. And so, and this is positively evil.
Yeah.
But I mean, what it expresses is a concern about the remoteness of government, a remoteness about, and about putting America first, and about restoring. Now, it's all been distorted. It's all been turned into a kind of nationalism, if you like, and it threatens as kind of fascism, because I really don't think the man would stop at using all the tools, all the powers at his disposal to enforce his rather horrible views. But it is an expression of public unrest and disquiet at the fact that governments don't seem to be able to control the economy, don't seem to be able to manage the economy. I like to use the word manage and not control, because, and it is true, our governments don't manage the economy. They more or less sit on their hands and say, well, no, it's not up to us, it's up to the market. And I think people have got wind of that. They're not stupid. And they think, well, if you can't do anything about this, I'm going to find me a strong man to protect me from market forces. And this is where Karl Polanyi comes in, because that was precisely his analysis, which is that in the 30s, people felt themselves governed by self-regulating markets, and that were beyond the reach of regulatory democracy and beyond the reach of politicians. And so they argued, well, in that case, we're going to find ourselves a strong man who will protect us, because if politicians won't protect us, we'll find a strong man who will, and it'll be a man, invariably. And in the case, Donald Trump is that man. He's going to build a wall. He's going to tackle the Chinese. He's going to take on those Europeans. He's going to do this, that, t'other. And the same applies to Mr. Bolsonaro in Brazil. The same applies to Mr. Putin in Russia, Mr. Duterte in the Philippines, Erdogan in Turkey, or Orban in Hungary. These are all strong men, nationalist, possibly, I'm quite sure would be fascist if they weren't constrained by their constitutions. And this is the response we saw in the 30s. So if we're going to do something about that, we have to restore policy autonomy to governments.
And that is paradoxically about actually getting them to collaborate effectively.
To collaborate, and that's why Gordon Brown is very right to start talking again about international coordination. But it is also about managing capital flows, managing trade flows, and even probably managing immigration flows. And the idea that we can have unmanaged flows of all of these goods and services and labour just swishing around the world, unmanaged in any way, is ludicrous. It's not a way to run the world, and it's not sustainable. It leads to the rise of nationalisms.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Anne. We will be taking up in the next issue more of these themes of international economic coordination, so we'll be returning to this. But that is a very good introduction to the debate. Thank you very much.
Thank you.